Welcome back to the second course stream this week. Where we left off? Well, we had just completed our first day of school, our first encounter with Confucianism, and I had told you that if you need a little bit more information on Confucianism, there's this very interesting, very short introduction to Confucianism, linked to that on iLearn. Now let's take a step back and try to connect the dots. Let's try to connect the Jesuits and Confucianism. And here are a couple more snippets from those letters that we've read, and I think they're going to give us a good insight. So in the top one he writes, "Besides that, in order that your reverence may also rejoice of some of our things, China is different from other regions and people, because the people here are wise. They are literate and not warmongers. They are people of great talent, and currently they're dubious about their culture and superstitions. Therefore, as I clearly see, it will be easy to convert a multitude of Chinese in a very short time. But on the other hand, the Chinese had always little commerce with foreigners and never wanted to have commercial relations with them." Now you will see again and again in these letters that he essentially promises that they will be very successful in a very short time at converting a lot of Chinese to Catholicism. And this is really interesting because the continued financial support of the Jesuit mission in China, which was very, very expensive because it was so far away, you needed to transport people there, you needed to maintain this whole missionary infrastructure, hinged on the prospect of converting the Chinese to Catholicism, right? The Jesuit headquarters back in Europe, in Paris, right? They thought of this as an investment, right? They only wanted to continue to finance missions that had a good return on their investment, right? So Matteo Ricci, and remember, right, this was letters, and these letters would take months, and a lot of them would get lost because the ships might not make it, right? He kept saying, just bear with us a little longer, we'll deliver, okay? Now back to that opening question from this week. Why did he change robes from Buddhist robes to the robes of the literati? Why did the Jesuits decide to foster a relationship with the literati and the Mandarin class? And again, one of these letters actually gives us an answer to that. I want to finish this part by talking about the support our faith has received in the books written by the Chinese literati. And the literati really is somewhat interchangeable with the Mandarin class, people who were highly educated in those Confucian classics, who were studying to become members of the bureaucracy of the government apparatus. Your Reverend knows that there are 3 sects in this realm. The most ancient, the literati, has always governed China. The other 2, Taoism and Buddhism, are idolatrous, meaning they pray to idols, right? Remember from Matteo Ricci? Matteo Ricci always kept saying, "Oh, I came into XY city and the people here are idolaters," meaning they pray to gods, right? Buddhist or Taoist gods. Often, they are not mutually exclusive. You might have a temple, where people pray to a multitude of gods, both from the Taoist and the Buddhist canon. So the other 2 are idolatrous, in disagreement, and are always combated by the literati. Even if the literati sect does not speak about supernatural things, their ethics are almost entirely in concordance with ours. Thus, I began to praise the literati in my books. Doing so allowed me to use them to confute the other sects without refuting the Confucian texts and interpreting places that seem contrary to our holy faith. Do you see what he's trying to do here? He is trying to find common ground between Christianity and Confucianism by essentially bashing Taoism and Buddhism. And he does so by emphasizing that Confucianism is not about supernatural things. That's Taoism and Buddhism, and of course to some degree Christianity, and that Christianity, of course, is concerned with the soul and the afterlife. So he says, well, there's Confucianism that does not concern itself with the matters of the soul. So maybe there could be a union between Confucianism and Christianity. And this process that the Jesuits essentially wanted to initiate, we usually refer to as accommodation. Now, during the Ming and later the Qing dynasty, Chinese elites identified with Confucianism. And as a result, the Jesuits chose Confucianism rather than Buddhism as the basis for this practice of accommodation. Now, Jesuit missionary policy as a whole stressed the accommodation of Christianity to indigenous elements of foreign culture. So we don't just see this in China. We see this everywhere, right? You couldn't just go and try to introduce something completely new, right? There was always an attempt at making it more tangible by relating it to existing intellectual or religious trends. And this is actually nothing unique to Christianity or Western religions. Actually, this is something we see everywhere where religious or philosophical practices are transplanted into other cultures. For example, when Buddhism arrived in China, and Buddhism, of course, is not originally a Chinese religion. It came from India, right? But when it came to China, it actually latched onto existing religious practices and ultimately adopted a lot of them. And, the end result is really a kind of more hybrid form of Buddhism. So in a way, accommodation, right, is something we see in other religions too. But, for the purpose of our class, let's think of accommodation as this practice that was really promoted by the Jesuits. Now, accommodation, interestingly, also forced them to make difficult choices about what to accept and what to reject, right? Because if they accepted elements of Chinese culture that contradicted their Christian faith, the accommodation would become theologically invalid. If, on the other hand, they did not accept certain essential elements of Chinese culture, then the Chinese would just reject Christianity as foreign and alien. And I'm quoting here from another chapter by Mongello that we're going to read next week. Now, as we already said, Confucianism was essentially a moral and societal teaching that spoke really only implicitly of spiritual forces. It speaks a little bit about ancestor worship, but it doesn't really speak so much about hell and the soul and all these things. Buddhism spoke specifically and in much greater detail on spiritual matters. Now, Confucianism's relative silence on spirits and matters of the soul made it less vulnerable to criticism as a pagan religion, and its emphasis on moral and spiritual cultivation was viewed as a reconcilable with Christianity's explicit treatment of spiritual forces and the idea of one God, monotheism, right? So again, Mongello will draw this out in a little bit more detail if you want to read up on that. So not surprisingly, during their time in China, the Jesuits continued to befriend members of the literati class, of the elite, by way really of their own erudition, by way of learning Chinese, mastering Confucian texts, but also very important because of their scientific abilities, right? The Jesuits were very learned, and they knew a lot about the world, and they knew a lot about astronomy and astronomy, right? At that time, that line maybe was a little bit more blurred. And also, in the fields of mathematics, medicine, and very important for next week, cartography. And here is a painting of, Matteo Ricci and a Chinese intellectual he became very close friends with, Xu Guangqi. So, two of the most prominent converts to Christianity were Xu Guangqi and Li Zhizao. And they both underwent religious experiences that were crucial to their decision to be baptized. Xu Guangqi repeatedly failed the highest level of civil service exams, right, the Jinshi exam. And this might have possibly made him more receptive to receiving instruction from the Jesuits. And Xu Guangqi actually later came to believe that Christianity could supplement Confucianism and displace Buddhism essentially as a religion in China. And Xu later collaborated with Ricci on translating important European texts. So he translates the 6 books of Euclid's Elements. These are ancient Greek treatises on mathematics. And he worked with Ricci on studies of both hydraulics and geography and also astronomy. Together they worked on a calendar. Now, Li Zhizao, on the other hand, was already a really high-ranking government official, a really, really important member of the ruling class of the bureaucracy. And he fell seriously ill in Beijing in early 1910, and he was personally nursed back to health by Matteo Ricci. And at what appeared to be the point of death, Li Zhizao actually accepted the Christian faith and was baptized by Ricci. And he actually later recovered. Unfortunately, Ricci died, just a little after that. And Li Zhizao was really impressed by the Jesuit knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, geometry, and geography. And he had worked with Matteo Ricci on a world map. Oh, there is that map again. We have to wait until next week to plunge into the secrets of that map. But for this week, let's emphasize that scientific knowledge and really erudition of the Jesuits greatly impressed these Confucian learned literati elites. Now, there were problems, even if they wanted to convert to Christianity, because, there were some major obstacles. Polygamy, that was, of course, not permitted by the Catholics, was one problem, because this was something that was generally practiced amongst especially the literati class in China. And there were others. But, those officials who did come in touch with the Jesuits were often genuinely impressed by their erudition. And here we actually have an account of this. So here is another high-ranking late Ming official, Li Zhi. And here is a letter. By the way, one word about romanizations. So this person here, Li Zhi, he is also sometimes spelled like this, C-H-I-H. This is the same pronunciation. This is a different romanization system, right? When we write characters in the Latin alphabet, we have to romanize them, right? And there are different systems. So Xu Guangqi sometimes is also written like this. Instead of an X, we have HSU. Li Zhizao sometimes written like this. But it's basically just a different way of writing the same Chinese characters. So what did Li Zhi have to say about Matteo Ricci? You ask about Ricci. He is a Westerner from the extreme West and traveled for over 100,000 li to reach China, sailing at first to South India, where he first learned of Buddha. When he reached Guangzhou and the South Sea, he found out that our great Ming realm has had the virtuous kings Yao and Shun and the sages Zhou and Confucius. He lived in the South and in Zhaoqing nearly 2 decades, reading every book of our nation, asking teachers to help him note the pronunciations and meanings of the words, so that now he is fluent in speaking and writing our language and following our rituals. He is a most urbane person. He is a most complex man, very plain and modest in his exterior, and listening to scores of people debating noisily, he can follow and recapitulate their arguments in order. I have never seen anyone more impressive. People are neither too critical nor too flattering, either showing off their brilliance or coming across as too dull. But I have no idea why he is here. I have met him 3 times already and still do not know his intention in coming here. Perhaps he wants to use his teachings to change our Confucian learning. But surely that would be silly and must not be the case. Isn't that a absolutely fascinating letter? Whenever I read this, I'm just always baffled that Li Zhi, right, he calls Matteo Ricci one of the most impressive persons you have ever met. I mean, what a compliment, right, from this guy. And you know, I mentioned earlier the concept of the man of complete virtue that Confucianism really aspired to, right? That Confucian learning should turn you into such a man, a junzi, a man of complete virtue. And I should say also a woman of complete virtue, right? If a woman studies the same books, she could also become a junzi, right? At least in the 21st century, that is. So Ricci clearly has become a junzi, a man of complete virtue in the eyes of Li Zhi. Okay, for our forum, we're going to do something really exciting today. I posted 2 articles, one on Xu Guangqi and one on Li Zhizao. And I want you to write a 500-word reading response in which you critically discuss the concept of Jesuit accommodation. And based on our class discussion and on the readings assigned so far, how did the Jesuits accomplish their objective of befriending members of the Chinese Mandarin class and of converting some of them to Catholicism? And you must draw in your analysis on one of these 2 chapters that I posted to iLearn. So I posted a chapter on Xu Guangqi and one on Li Zhizao. So you can pick your preference. And as always, I want you to cite these articles and I want you to engage with this concept of accommodation through these 2 texts. So please cite concrete examples of why either of them became interested in the Jesuits and what role the concept of accommodation played. And I will see you again next week.